I am very honored to have Richard Flyer on Illuminating Life. Thank you so much for being here, Richard. You are the author of a book that just came out, I believe, very recently called Birthing the Symbiotic Age. And you also have a great Substack, and you've been posting a lot of excerpts and articles that are sharing some of the gold that is in this book. I've had your links to some of your articles shared to me from several people that I feel are very trustworthy people in my life. And so I've known about you for a while, and it wasn't until you posted a reply on an article I recently published called "The Metamodern Regenerative Village," which I really appreciated. It was yeah, evoking a little bit of the quality of curiosity and maybe even healthy tension around the most productive and strategic ways to create transformational change. And you had some maybe critiques or perspectives on the metamodern movement as a whole and how sometimes the culture can orient towards certain ways of creating transformation that might differ from some of the work that you're doing in the world. And so I asked you if you would want to come on and just have a dialogue about it. And mostly, I'm also just very curious about you, your passion, your aliveness, the work you've been doing in the world, and wanting to share that with those who are listening. So, welcome.
Tucker, thank you so much for having me. And as I was saying offline, yeah, I hope to get to know you better. And yeah, even though it may have sounded as a critique, I'm more in the both and universe rather than an either or one. So
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I felt that. Yeah, critique it's in the healthiest expression of a
I got it.
critique of like a hey, let's really look at this. Which I really
Yeah.
appreciate. And in some ways I feel sometimes there's so much love and celebration and appreciation amongst those in my social network, you could say. And to be able to kind of poke a little bit or call each other forth or say, hey, well, why don't you look in that direction as well? I think it's a very generative form of, in a way, also a type of masculine. There's a masculine quality that I appreciate in that. And so it's fun to have you on.
Oh, you mean the masculine quality as in different ways of looking at order or where order comes from?
Yeah, yeah, it's a little bit of I don't mean masculine in a male-bodied sense, but in the yang expression
Yeah. Yeah.
of like pointing and like cutting through and
I
really
got you.
like getting to the heart of something. Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to read just I was looking at one of your essays and I'll link to that in the show notes. I just wanted to read a couple of lines that you wrote because I think it really beautifully captures some of the essence of what you're up to. You write, my work and my book, Birthing the Symbiotic Age, is rooted in this conviction that a new civilization is already emerging, not through centralized design, but through grassroots reweaving, where the relational fabric of communities is being restored through love, virtue, and shared purpose. This essay explores how such a civilization can grow and why the key lies not in ideology or control, but in a shared relational protocol rooted in love. In asking how this emergence could scale, I've returned repeatedly to a question. What kind of invisible infrastructure could allow diverse communities, religious and secular, urban and rural, left and right, to cohere, collaborate, and coordinate across silos? I just really appreciate that. It feels like, in many ways, the questions that you evoke there are at the heart of my heart, and part
Oh,
of what I'm deeply in devotion to as well.
that's great. I understand you have some background in intentional communities yourself, Tucker.
Yeah, I mean, long story short is I went to the first intentional community that I ever visited. It was called Dancing Rabbit Eco Village. It was in
Mm.
2018. So, gosh, what about 8 years now? And I went for a 2 week apprenticeship program. It was after I read Sebastian Junger's book Tribe,
Yeah.
and also
Yeah.
Johan Hari's book Lost Connections. And at the time, I was living in LA. I was kind of at the height of my material success in this big, beautiful home in Venice Beach, and I was a commercial and documentary filmmaker, traveling all over the world, and I was really feeling like, okay, I've really I live such a beautiful life in so many ways, and there's this God-sized hole in my heart that I feel there's some depth of being that I haven't touched yet. And so those two books kind of got me turned on to the idea of what it might be like to live in more of an ancient future village-like context.
Yeah.
And as a documentary filmmaker, since I was 13 years old, I've always had an anthropological way of relating to reality. And so I just sort of kicked up this inner immersive anthropologist, I call myself sometimes, where I traveled to these different communities and spent time living and researching and playing and being blown away and also being very humbled by how much, hard work and challenges often live in these
Yeah.
experiments that are playing out. And that brought me all over the world for 8 years. It continues today. I've
Wow.
visited, I think, close to like 100 different communities of all sorts, and yeah.
Hey, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
feel very
Thank you
blessed.
for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah, what about you? What's your connection into this relational infrastructure that lives as community? It seems like you're approaching it both from a global networked perspective, but also a very local, lived, in-person relational perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think where it comes from is deep experience, both spiritual awakening, more than 50 years ago, that kind of set me on a path to ask some questions like if ultimate reality and the experience of that is one interconnected fabric, if that's the experience of it, and the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself, and almost like you can feel a palpable trust at some deeper level of spiritual reality. Have those experiences led me to look at human society when I was like teenager and looked at like, well, if there's a sense of unity within this transcendent reality, why are we living this way? So it's an obvious question, right? It's not like I'm not the first to ask. It's probably one of those questions that, tons of people are asking. It's just for me, I received this opening, this spiritual opening, it was kind of part joyous, but also traumatic. And then it opened my heart to what's happening in the world. And for whatever reason, it was spontaneous. I took in that suffering. So it became personal. So the connection between let's call it the smaller self and this, global civilization that I'm just learning about that was forming me. It was forming me. And that's why I call it a culture of separation. So I was trying to always figure out how to reconcile heaven and earth, to put it more poetically, or to me, it's real, how to connect heaven to earth. And I've just been involved in community building experiments for 40 years. And it's experimental, but also trying to answer that question for myself. Like, how do we actually achieve an infrastructure that derives from love, from a divine love, not love as feeling, but love as structure,
Mm,
the foundational architecture of reality, like a sacred design. So just it's this idea of a sacred design for me has never been primarily academic or philosophical. It's experiential. And I'm fortunate enough over the last, 40 years to encounter a variety of teachers, but mostly movements that reflect this kind of integration of personal and collective spiritual development and healing.
mhm. Beautiful. There's so much there. Yeah, I just feel a full body resonance, which is beautiful. Yeah. I want to just dive right into the sacred design aspect. What are the design principles of love as you know them?
So that's a great question. It just sounds so like, well, what is that? And I was thinking to myself, well, I'll do my best to share my experience rather than it being some like a academic, like
Sure.
an answer,
Yeah, great. Perfect.
Yeah, that it's what I appreciate your question. So for me, the experience I had as a child revealed what I'm calling an ancient blueprint, a pattern, a sacred design. And when I say it's love, a transcendent love, a divine love, what I'm meaning is that it's part of the building process of our universe. It's what connects everything and what holds the connection and sustains the connection. So, in that sense, it's parallel in a spiritual sense to how gravity underlies the physical forces in the universe. You know, how gravity, as an invisible power, if you will, holds things together, things with mass like the earth, the moon, the sun. Similarly, deeper down, in my belief, this physical design has a correlate and is only a reflection of an underlying spiritual sacred design. So what we see as ecosystems and forests, and I'm a biologist by training, so I use my scientific understanding, but I'm seeing that, yeah, that nature itself is a reflection of this sacred design. So the question was like, yeah, I started to relate to this and develop it organically within myself. It's not something that I really was aware of, back then. And certainly in the last 4 years of writing the book, I had to come up with a language to describe my experience, but I didn't want it to seem like I was presenting it like it was my idea or as a new idea, therefore creating my own language, which I believe that would have led to a trap of me then being seen for some, like, oh yeah, here's the guy, he's got this answer, and oh, he's got this language, and he's selling books, and he's got workshops, and he's on the consultant trail or whatever. I'm
Mm,
not, that's not what I'm doing. I chose instead to use accepted terms from history, mostly from the Western spiritual tradition, like metanoia, to describe a conversion experience, if you want to use that term, from a life lived as a local self, identifying with whatever we're identifying our worldly connections, masculine, feminine, business person, religious leader, spiritual, religious,
mhm,
atheist, left, right, whatever. So metanoia is the process that's been described. It's both a Greek term and an early Christian term for the conversion of the mind away from the world into the transcendent or this sacred design. And that's one term. And the other language term that I used, so that I didn't end up creating my own kind of framework, I, I was thinking about this a lot. So I used the term transcendent, as in transcendent reality, to define the experience that I had and where this idea of a sacred design or a pattern, where it comes from. So I used a Western spiritual tradition. And the idea of a transcendent, though, is actually bigger than the Western. In the first axial age, like 2,500 years ago, there seemed to be the emergence of this common shared idea of a transcendent reality. So this is, within India, gave rise to Buddhism. You got Confucianism, you got Lao Tse, you got, the precursors and the wisdom traditions of the Old Testament. You've got the philosophers of 5th century BC, the Greeks, talking about the logos, this transcendent reality. And then finally, with coming of Jesus and that the message in the Sermon on the Mount, it's all about that transcendent principle. And I believe, in its application in community, in the world. I hope that addressed it, maybe as circuitous.
yeah, no, it's beautiful. I imagine most listeners will feel right there with you. A deep sense of understanding what you're speaking to. And yeah, so I guess I'm curious from those transcendent principles and experiences that you've had, what has been the process of bringing that into form in a way that has led to a book and all the community work that you've been up to? And yeah, this is a big question, I know, but what are some of the key insights and learnings that you've discovered along the way?
Yeah, so one of them I think I can talk about is how human society seems to be fragmented into silos, and how silos are a natural, they're endemic to the civilization we have right now, not just Western, but globally. And silos reflect a pattern of social organization where people create their own internal tribes that are different than other tribes. So you establish a sense of kinship primarily with your in-group tribes. And that's natural. That's just been the way for probably hundreds, 200,000 years, like the development of the tribal sensibility. And it's endemic. It's like the religious sensibility. They're part of our makeup. There's no getting rid of them. You can't get rid of those things. They're there and they manifest in different ways. So yeah, so I'm sorry, I must have I might have diverged from your question.
No, it's all good.
Tell
I'm
me,
enjoying the thread.
yeah, okay. So that was the first part of it. You had asked me,
Yes. Well,
sorry.
I'm curious about that. So sometimes when I listen to your writing, I'm hearing a sense of wanting to remind folks that we're all made from the divine creation. We're all part of love that is the inherent fabric of reality itself, and that the relationships that bind our differences and distinctions, at least on a relative level, are unified in this one experience of love. And I'm wondering for you, how do you work with and re-embracing the distinctions and the differences and the uniquenesses of the human and more than human world, while also remaining at home in the oneness that we share, and then apply that in collective
Yeah.
context.
Then I think the best thing to do would share some practical like stories
Right.
like
Love it.
along the way. Um, Now I finally remembered your question. Sorry about that.
No, it's all good.
You know, um, so I didn't have these concepts and labels like transcendent or metanoia, or even know that there was a lineage that I was part of. That came much later in the writing of the book. But there was some intuitive sense as a result of this transcendent experience and a series of experiences that led me to understand that on the one hand, you have this experience of unity, everything's connected. On the other hand, there's this fragmentation. So that dissonance, that's what, drove me into the heart of community. And it was more intuitive. I had no background in community organizing or development. And one story I think is relevant would be in 1991, I was working in a low-income, multi-ethnic neighborhood that was Hispanic and African American, about 50,000 people. It was an area called Logan Heights. And in Logan Heights, it was probably the highest poverty in San Diego County, in the early 90s. It was one of those things where in the 1960s, where there were urban riots in response to both the Black Power movement, anti-war movements. There was this kind of culmination at that point. Many stores, like regular grocery stores, mainstream grocery stores, they left low-income urban communities and never came back.
Mhm.
So here's a community that I was living in and developing community with. This one street corner had like 40 drug dealers from mostly from the the cartels that were
Mhm.
close to us in Tijuana. Anyway, they were there on the street corner in broad daylight. Police would drive by. Um, Women and children were kind of trapped in their homes because it was unsafe. There were drive-by shootings between rival gangs down this street and in this area. Um, Many times some of the men would just be hanging out in a group drinking what they in Spanish a caguama of like some beer, right? So it was just kind of like this disconnected, separated environment. And the tribes, in this sense, the siloing were the Black and Hispanic community organizations that had distinct interests in relationship to the government to be able to achieve benefit and development of their own respective constituencies, right? They were different tribes. But you also had Black churches and Hispanic churches. For example, there was this one church called Christ the King. It was a Catholic church led by, um, it was mostly a Spanish speaking at the time. So these were silos in my mind. And I realized that all of these folks and all the leaders and all their networks, what I call network silos, were isolated from one another, and nobody was actually solving this problem.
Mm.
Okay, so it was a crisis, and seems to be how people um, learn and grow is through personally through crisis. But in this case, this neighborhood was in crisis. So what I realized, and just to kind of hone in to how I connected this experience of transcendent reality with this specific situation, it was the insight that I could build bridges between all of these competing and separate, isolated silos
Mm.
of organizations and networks that were out there. And that this particular urban scenario where you got drug dealing and crime and violence is enough of an incentive from which people can say, huh, we realize that we have all these differences, but we can share and agree that we would like a safer, healthier community where this is not going on. So that was the insight, and it was a practical one. So in that case, I started building relationships with the different leaders in all the different tribes. I became like, it's like an ambassador from divine love.
Mm.
So what that means is holding space for an entire community, in that case, that neighborhood. So not just holding space for me as a person, like it was my own spiritual path and growth that's separate from others. And it wasn't just my family's holding space for my family. It was the street that I lived on, the neighborhood, and then this local larger neighborhood. So holding space means to connect all of what's alive already happening around a functional purpose. In this case, it was having a safer neighborhood. So there's no hardly any kind of philosophic conversation. There's no like specific worldview that I am telling them they have to agree on in order to participate. It happened organically and naturally, and that's when I realized that building bridges in this way creates something unique, and I happen to call it a symbiotic network, in that it doesn't necessarily have to become a formal nonprofit or a business, and it's better if it doesn't, because it's a network-centric structure that then creates horizontal type leadership that emerges. But you still need a container. And I think that could be a thread of our conversation is, well, what is that container? What does coherence mean? And how can you build coherence? How can people speak of coherence in so many different ways? And maybe later I can talk about that, about, exploring.
Well, I love it. Maybe we just go right into it now. And yeah, let me just pause for a sec to see if there's something else there. Yeah, I'm also just interested in the practicality of a concrete mission, like a shared mission that is very functional to day-to-day life and
Yeah.
the usefulness of that. And that's something that we see often in natural disasters or in
Uh,
um, any sort of, after terrorist attacks or wars. I was in Ukraine about a year and a half ago and got to see the
oh,
resiliency of how folks are coming together when there's the practicality of survival or getting food and water. These things kind of bring it down to a basic level and often can create a sense of relational infrastructure. In Asheville, North Carolina, where I have a bunch of friends who live after the hurricane that and the floods that swept through there, there was this amazing mutual aid
yeah.
grassroots network that emerged. And yeah, there's kind of a sadness that I feel of like, why does it take literally being on the brink of death in order to create such structures that most people seem to recognize are deeply benefiting
Yeah.
the well-being of their lives?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I've been reflecting on that question for decades, which is, yeah, why does it take us a human or man-made disaster to bring us together, only to stay together in this open awareness of unity for maybe a few days, a week, and then we go back into the silos? And that's a profound question because I look at my work as trying to provide an answer to that question, which is how do you do that 24/7? How do you convert that kind of liminality, the sense of the unknown that leads us to kind of break down these barriers of left versus right, religious, non-religious, male, female, rich, poor, ethnic, whatever your, race, doesn't, none of that matters in this context of dealing with what's happening, dealing with the disaster. So in my book, where I'm talking about all the stories, and I shared one story about public safety in that gang kind of infested drug dealing infested neighborhood. Yeah, I realized that there was a series of crises that were underneath the surface that I wasn't aware of. I was just responding organically and naturally as a person, but I wasn't aware of it until in retrospect. So that was a crisis that created, in a sense, the opening for people to go beyond their silos and build bridges. So that was the reason. People need a reason. Today, the difference is that the crisis that we face is not just it's not global, just global, it's national and it's local. And it's kind of like it's like we're all watching, let's call it a slow moving apocalypse.
Yeah, that's a
And
great term.
nobody
Yeah.
knows when it's going to hit the fan, or nobody knows. People talk about, breakdown, and I think that's legitimate. Just on one level, financially, the U.S. has almost a $40 trillion debt load. It's just
Yeah.
not sustainable. So everybody is seeing this. They see war, they see climate change, and the challenge is those are so many big ideas and big concepts, and people organize around one or another of them. The question is, have people felt that we're in a crisis long enough for them to devote themselves to an ongoing way of life that not only creates more abundance for them, but also transforms these systems?
Yeah. 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 Well, I sense that there's more so than ever, at least it feels in my awareness more so than ever that there's a generation of folks who are devoting their their deepest soul expression to that work
Yeah.
and how to actually do that practically and to interface with the current systems and structures that, for the most part, are still quite strong and durable, and probably will be for quite some time. I'm not so sure that there's going to be one moment where just like the lights go off and everything goes down. I like the slow moving metaphor feels more apt to me of a likely scenario, but. Yeah, I guess I'm curious just to go back to the case study of this community that you worked in San Diego. What happened and how did that play out and what happened over time as well, looking back?
Yeah. So bringing together these leaders and citizens from different backgrounds, we started with the premise of, in a sense, like reoccupying the hood. Like,
Mm,
this is our street. These are our streets, and we can't even go out because it's dangerous. So that's like such a primal organizing point. So what we did is, instead of quote protesting something, which was reacting, we turned it into a positive.
mm,
So we started by getting just neighbors and others to come together and march for peace, not against war, but for peace, not against these drug dealers, but for peace and
mm,
for presence, stepping up, stepping into that role of caring for yourself, your family, your neighbor. And we started doing these peace marches over a 2 block area. So that's like setting the intention, like in a neighborhood, literally.
mm,
So then after that, after getting some kind of more concrete involvement, we noticed together, oh wow, there are these empty lots and they're filled with trash. So then we started seeing, oh, this is something we could do together. Wouldn't it be nicer to have a beautiful neighborhood where we're not having trash? So all of us together were, cleaning up and began to consider doing some community gardens in those spots. There was some other challenges. There were drug houses. There were like 6 drug houses on these 2 streets. And that was the challenge, is that people would come from the wealthy communities like La Jolla, Claremont, and they'd come into this kind of like poor, low income ghetto area to buy their drugs. I mean, it's endemic of an extractive model of global
Mm,
economy. So it was a metaphor that I began to see. I began to sense into that, wow, people in this neighborhood, we don't own our own homes. So 90% of the people were renters. 90% of the people that lived there had to work outside the communities because 90% of the businesses were owned by people out from the outside. So it was a perfect example, like a metaphor of how this particular low income neighborhood, in a sense, was a colony, in a sense, of the mainstream San Diego economy, in
hmm
that they were extracting the financial capital, especially in an ongoing period of decades where there was no resolution of it. Nobody was suggesting any answer at all. It was just kind of a stagnant and people living in fear. So that's what we had to address. And that's why we did those marches, started doing positive activities, getting a bunch of the leaders, especially religious leaders from these different backgrounds, to come together and every night walk down the street to witness, is a good term, to the 40 drug dealers on the corner. And it went something like, we love you as human beings and respect the dignity as children of God, but we don't love your behavior and we're not going to tolerate it anymore.
mm.
So here are your choices. Seriously, like that's what it was like, but in a, maybe I'm being too, sounds harsh, but it was kind of like a tough love kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so eventually within several years, we ended up forming a food cooperative in an empty liquor store. We actually got some government funding we bought a whole facility, turned it into a food cooperative that became an employee-owned store that actually then migrated to becoming more traditional corporation, and
Mm,
a school behind it. So this was like a sequence, a process of building a network, and it starts with trust. It doesn't start with any ideology,
mm,
because ideologies are narrowing. Like let's say, well, we want to get all the people that are against war together, or we want to get to all the people that are pro-war, or we're going to get all the MAGA supporters together. We're going to get all the progressives together, or we're just going to stay in our religious silo or our spiritual but not religious silo. So those
mm,
are all like what we're facing. And in this case, in order to deal with the fact that we have all these tribes and networked silos, and the idea is just, yeah, it's very straightforward. Building a bridge based on love and connecting beyond the silos to bring everybody together, bring that which is separate together to achieve a tangible, functional community goal or series of goals. So
mm,
it's contextualized that way. So you could say it would be like divine love through positive virtues in action in building community ecosystem networks.
mhm,
So that's a natural flow. So this transcendent power, which I believe is real, not a metaphor, it's not poetic. I experience it as real. And through that transcendent divine love, the way it resides, or we allow it to take home, I say it, within us are the virtues: forgiveness, patience, kindness, love, sharing, respect, justice. Those are the virtues that start getting inculcated as you build these cooperative, collaborative networks.
mm,
So many people talk about, well, you got to build. The problem today is coordination. You hear a lot of people, especially in tech, who are developing regenerative tech. You'll hear this a lot, like, oh yeah, the problem is coordination. So therefore, there's these solutions that can get people together. But I don't believe that to be true. I don't believe it's the primary challenge, because underneath a coordination problem is a collaboration problem, like getting people to each even work together. Like, why are they coming together? And underneath collaboration is the ability to cooperate. If you don't know how to cooperate, just saying let's cooperate is going to lead to pain and suffering because people end up always breaking down and fighting if they're not working on themselves while they're working with others. So we've known that path for thousands of years. It leads to empires. It leads to, dead ends. And
Yeah,
I'm bringing this up because I think the problem is a coherence challenge. The question is, what are you cohering around? And that's
right.
the issue. Are we cohering around an ideological framework within singular worldviews? Or is there a broader coherence that we could connect people around that would include all of the other worldviews? So that literally, I know it's like a very nerdy thing, but that's what I've been thinking about for literally 40 years. And I trying to answer this question. How do we deal with the fact that we're in a culture of separation to build a culture of connection that requires what I call symbiotic kinship, the conscious intention to go beyond your tribe, to build bridges to others for a concrete community end? So
Yeah.
that description involves what I call a relational worldview. So it's a worldview of sorts, but it's not a worldview that's separate from others. It's a worldview whose life is bridging all the other worldviews. So there's nothing, quote, ideological about that. So it's not about bringing all the folks within each thing, each tribe, each network together within themselves only, because that's normal. That's what we do. In addition to doing all of the goodness that's happening in all the silos, what I'm saying is we need a trust layer even before that. We need to focus on that larger, broader sense of love and humanity that the people in the mainstream will get. And it's not ideology at all. It's something much deeper and broader in its language, its messaging, and its purpose.
Mhm. Beautiful. I absolutely love everything you're saying. I feel full resonance with it. And I'm also curious, you know, I've heard many times of well, there's historical examples, and then there's modern examples or present day examples, and you touched a little bit around some of the differences, but I just want to go directly there. In the past, there's missionaries, for example, that will go to a different community or a different culture
Right.
and basically spread the love of Jesus or whatever it is. And then in more present day scenarios, there's often younger folks generally who are really wanting to create, harmony and peace, and they go to an impoverished neighborhood or they go to some sort of place where there's a need of support, and they basically in a way bring their very heartfelt desires to create a
Yeah.
better community, but the locals don't necessarily trust these people and they kind of feel projected on. They don't feel like there's that relational trust and depth over
Yeah.
time that's actually creates a sense of bond of safety. And so there's a feeling of like, get out of here. What do you young people know? Why are you coming in here and
Yeah.
projecting your worldview onto us? And so how do you avoid these types of things, and what have you done differently that's worked?
No, that's a deep, amazing, very important question, which is to some extent, what's the relationship between the ideas that many of us might have about transformation and the real communities that are existing in the world? And I think the best mentor guide for me was Dr. A.T. Adiyaratna, who founded the Buddhist-based Sarvodaya movement 65 years ago. That's still going. He passed 2 years ago, bless his heart. But what I learned from Dr. Ari when he began his Sarvodaya movement, which has touched millions of Sri Lankans, currently in a network of 5,000 local ecosystem networks. So it's a network of 5,000 ecosystem networks that's national. So it's a multi-scalar network in the sense that it's horizontally involved and touches an entire community, and it's vertically connected because each of those communities are connected to each other through infrastructure that's emergent and fractal, but creates these higher levels of infrastructure to actually get things done. In that kind of context, Dr. Ari began in 1958 in one village. He was a high school science teacher, worked at a middle class high school, and they did they went into a village. It was a really poor village with middle class high school students, which was initially going to be like a service learning thing.
Hmm.
So I'm going to fast forward to that whole process of do the people who want to help how do you actually interact with those that are on the ground? And what I learned from Dr. Ari was this. He's the one that showed me how to hold space for love in a community context. And it means dealing with the ego challenges that we have as people as we do organizational or community things. Like, these are the pitfalls. One, I'm doing this because I want to help the less fortunate, but I'm actually kind of feeling superior to them.
Hmm.
Or I'm doing this because I want to develop a consultancy and make money. Or I'm doing it because I want a title. I like being important and recognized. Or I'm doing it because I've got like some political objective is that I want to use some type of community connectivity so I can get involved in the official electoral politics and run for office. Yeah, so it's either power, money, political ideology. Everybody, all of us push that 24/7. We're just totally unaware of it.
Yeah.
So to build community in the way that I think into your question is, you truly have to hold space for love and be conscious and aware of all the shadow material that's coming up that would actually separate you from the people you're working with. So the spiritual practice is not something separate. It's part of this engagement with the collective. And that's what I learned from Dr. Ari is how to integrate what they call in Buddhism, in their movement, personality awakening at the person level with building infrastructure at the collective level, and how those are two seamless aspects of the same thing. Now, that process, even though there's a spiritual aspect to it, doesn't replace someone's pre-existing religious or spiritual commitments. You could still be a church-going Christian, even a traditional, you could be a conservative, you could be a progressive, you could be religious, non-religious, all the above. Um, so you don't have to give up, you know, you don't have to give up your identity. But this process of integrating spirit and collective community action is more like a supplemental spiritual practice. It's where you're proving and demonstrating the fruits of what you say you believe, and
Hmm.
you're communicating to everybody about who you think you are, especially in the spiritual and religious world. That's why there's hypocrites everywhere, not just within Christianity. There's hypocrites in every community of people getting together who aren't living the values they profess. In this case, the values that we would profess, the virtues, are foundational. So they are in Sarvodaya. There's four, they call it the four sublime abodes of Buddhism: compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, and empathetic joy in the joy of others. So those are the four virtues.
Say them again.
So there's four, it's called the four sublime abodes of Buddha. So
Hmm.
loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and joy in the joy of others. So those are like the qualities that you could think of as just personal virtues, right? That's how we think in the West. It's all fragmented. Spirituality, politics, economics, it's all separate, and it's on purpose to keep us from integrating and keep us like, hypnotized to be good consumers. That's the plan. That's the global plan. It's not just a Western thing. It's not just American. This whole planet is doing that. So these virtues, in this Sarvodaya sense, they're inculcated, they're integrated, but they become relational virtues, relational qualities that now are applied at a larger level. And that's the only way to determine whether someone is full of it, just talking a game, or whether they're living it. And living it, it's visible. It's visible in acts of love, acts of service, being open to, being of service to other groups, and especially working with people that you may not like, or you may really not just may not like, but you could dislike, for example, progressives and MAGA. I mean, it's hard to imagine in the American experience right now for people, how the hell are they going to, how are we going to resolve this polarization? And that's the question that I've been addressing for 40 years, and looking to other examples like Sarvodaya. And there's some other movements that I could talk about if you're interested today.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the territory that you're covering. It's fantastic. Just to get even a little bit more granular and practical, you've had a number of these transcendent experiences, and I can feel that embodied in you in the way that you show up in your presence. And for those that maybe share the mission and the desire to create the change that you're talking about, but haven't had as much or haven't as fully integrated those types of experiences, and that still feels a bit more of a stretch or reach for them. How are they able to participate in this work when, like, does it require a certain spiritual capacity in order to be a leader in this work?
To be okay, there's like two parallel answers, but yes, yes. So that there is a need for people to have proficiency in practicing the virtues, and or they have to realize the importance of virtues, and realizing that they're not, they've got a lot of growth to do, like all of us do, but maybe they're just starting out. Um, and as long as a person who abides and says, yes, this is important, yes, I support this, as long as they're willing to deal with their own, darkness, that which is hidden, as long as they're willing to do that. And this is how it manifests. I'll give you one example. Um, and this happened to me. And this is fast forward to the movements networks I built in Reno, Northern Nevada. It was at some point that I realized that even though I was following Jesus at the time, and open spiritually, and even attended some local evangelical churches, I had antipathy towards religion. So I wasn't aware, even me, I've been involved for years, and all of a sudden this comes up and I go, damn, I am wounded. I'm angry about all of the violence, and the from all religion, not just Christianity. And what I realized was that I had a progressive worldview at the time that I didn't even know I had.
Mhm.
The progressive worldview is like this: you believe that you're righteous and morally superior. This is I'm telling you from my own inside experience. I had to overcome that point of view, because I realized, wow, my antipathy to Christianity actually came from my progressivism. I didn't even know I had. I didn't even know that there was such a thing
Yeah.
as a political worldview. I just assumed it was normal. Okay, that's the fundamental challenge of metanoia, of conversion, from over identifying with any identity. And what that means is you don't have to get rid of your identity. It just means you have to see that your identity is in competition to some extent, or is interacting with people with, literally billions of other worldviews or reality structures. So
Mhm.
that insight led me to realize, because you were asking for something practical, and I hope this is an example, is what I did then is, wow, I've got antipathy towards religion, mostly Christianity, since it's the majority religion in Europe and United States. I'm going to show up in their camp. I'm going to go to the quote enemy's camp. And I did that for a year. I visited pretty much every religious organization and spiritual organization. So mostly they were Christian, but different flavors of Christianity. But then, there's mosques and synagogues, a lot of Buddhist meditation groups, yoga groups. So I went to them all after a year, and I was showing up. And what I realized is that people are people, they're individuals. They may be part of like a Christian church, but they're not limited to it. They're just human beings. And that my antipathy towards a construct like organized religion, Christianity, was part of a postmodern view that was trying to deconstruct all kind of sources of meta narratives like, oh, yeah, the church.
Mhm.
But we threw the baby Jesus out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
We threw out the transcendent foundation, say, of Christianity, not only throwing out the Christian religion. And what I saw in those, especially Christian churches, were people that were really, many were living it. They're already doing it. They're on the ground. They're doing it in acts of service, dealing with homelessness, feeding the hungry, and they're following Jesus. But the people who are like me before, the progressives, would put them in a box and just stereotype them. And
Yeah.
that's what I learned, that I had to overcome that. It wasn't them. They didn't have to change. I had to realize, wow, if I want to unify my community, I've got to unify what's separated in me.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
way to do that is not in my mind or in some cave in Tibet, or some monastery, which you could do, I suppose. It's in action. It's in the intention to unify a community. You're called to be real.
Mhm.
Anything that's against unity is going to come up and it's going to be of a challenge. So I would say that this work is simple, yet it's hard. It's the
Mhm.
most challenging thing ever.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen to that. So I want to just you speak very eloquently about the what would I say? The transmission feels like it's coming through strong. And in your book and some of your writings, you've broken down into quite specific structures and forms, different
Yeah,
ways of relating to culture building, community building. And I want to dive
yeah,
into some of that territory. And I want to start with trust and coherence. You've mentioned these words a few
yeah.
times. How specifically would you recommend, based off your experience and based off what you advocate in the book, when someone is going into either a new community or the community they're already a part of, or they're starting something from fresh, how does one create trust and coherence in a way that can bring in that transcendent dimension and the horizontal dimension
Yeah.
simultaneously?
Amazing question. That's a great question, Tucker. Um, I'm going to give you an example of how these things could emerge, and it'll be the street that I'm on. I'm on a suburban street in the island of Oahu. I'm in a small town of 30,000 on the other side of the mountains from Honolulu, which is a big city of maybe 600,000. So we started just getting to know our neighbors. We would run into them. We made ourselves open to that. So we started making connections with our neighbors and getting to know them and being available and open to interaction. And I want to share the experience of my wife. It's really pretty cool. It illustrates the connection between even a neighbor and an entire region. So my wife is a painter. So for the last 4 years, she's continued to develop her skill. In the last year, she's become a commercial painter. And part of that is due to first having one of our neighbors, like two houses down, the woman there, one of the of this marriage, she's a painter. She offers like a class every Tuesday, and people from the neighborhood but elsewhere come. So my wife started attending that class like once a week, and it's not for regeneration or spiritual enlightenment or any of that. It's literally, being open. So if you're open to your neighbors, and you can find affinities, and that's one that was concrete. But what's interesting is after being there, she learned about some other groups. And my wife ended up joining plein air groups, like open air painting in the tradition of Renoir, Monet,
Mm,
those guys they were like outside. So there are groups that do that. So she kind of you had this connection with a neighbor. It led to these multiple groups, which then led to events, which led to her connecting, potentially with five different existing art associations of artists and cultural workers, mostly painters of different kinds. So that's an example of something in which it it's only a part of it. I'm giving you this example of how it could work. Now, that doesn't create a parallel structure just yet, but I'm giving some examples though, and I'm trying to differentiate that from existing kinds of movements. For example, this actually happened once. I posted a version of my chapter on revillaging a neighborhood in Reno, Nevada, at the actual neighborhood and the street level. And I remember a guy, he's the leader worldwide of a variety of regenerative movements, culture, community, economy movements. And he said, why would I want to get to know my neighbor? They don't think like they're not in line with regenerative culture and community. Why would I want to do that? And to be honest, I think I was initially upset by that, but then I went to compassion and I go, wow, this is such a challenge for people and us who are trying to make change, um, to compartmentalize. We're compartmentalizing reality. Yeah, and that's a judgment I'm making. I get it. I get it. However, I think I was reacting to when someone says my affinity has to be ideological. I'm differentiating that from symbiotic culture. Symbiotic culture doesn't start with ideological frames or worldview frames, other than love, other than our shared humanity, other than the desire to connect a community and to build a parallel community, a parallel culture, parallel economy that reflects love as an
Mhm.
operating system.
Mhm.
In order to do that, everybody has to be invited and we need to connect with everybody on that level. So the irony is when I connected on my street with my neighbors around this bigger idea, what happened was we would identify all the people that are backyard farmers. They're growing food in a
Mhm.
regenerative way. So then if you do it in this level, if you do it in the sequence of building trust where you're not ideological or worldview centric, you're just human and love centric, then you expand and you find out that there are people in all of these camps. There are Christians, there's people into regen, there's so building a neighborhood coming together in a bigger picture allows for those that are in the specific tribes, regen, local economy, civic engagement, religious, to actually
Mhm.
come together around this higher principle beyond any identification. They don't have
Mhm.
to stop being themselves and what's passionate about, and yet building bridges can only be done between these silos. It's not generally being done within the silos. In fact, within network silos, people are trying to convert others to join them. So they're using the same, I would say, colonial methodology that's extractive because we're organisms. We're part of the living environment. And if we're in a network silo, it's natural for us to want to consume resources to grow. We want to consume people. We want to consume and get money. We're
Mhm.
opportunistic and not, that's not bad. I'm not saying that that's wrong or bad. I'm saying that's what leads to silos and narrowing and why people and leaders within silos generally aren't building bridges as part of their function. So I believe it requires a new community function in addition to working in all the network silos and threads of movements that are already on the ground. There needs to be a connective interstitial tissue created. Many people believe, oh, that'll just be emergent and self-organizing. Well, that's partially true. But coherence is around love, sacred design, and bringing that which is separate together and to building a strong, resilient community. That's what the coherence is around. It's not coherence around any particular worldview. It's around a new function of connectivity. And right now, to be honest, there are network weavers, but they're all operating in narrow frames, and it's good that they're doing that. But what symbiotic culture posits is that, wow, there's all these areas that we can connect and come together around. Can we put that into a coherent um, uh, infrastructure,
Mhm.
a
Yeah.
network that maintains the coherence of love rather than breaking down into the old system?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so I'm not sensing that you would differ with this, but I just want to both and something that you're sharing of to me, it feels like I've noticed in my own life there's a bit of a pendulum where I was living this very sort of exclusive, curated life where I was a filmmaker, with a lot of successful people in the ad industry. And I'd walk outside of my expensive home and walk past the homeless person and not even know their name and didn't know any of my neighbors. Um, and then the pendulum swung where there were many years of really wanting to just focus on who I'm around, getting to know my next door neighbors, being grounded in the here and now, just really bringing that open-hearted love and sense of coming without an agenda, um, really feeling the divine wholeness of each being, as well as appreciating their uniqueness, of course. And then there's sort of this both and integration that's happened recently, which is like, okay, just like I enjoy watching the New York Yankees because there's a curated group of athletes that have a specialty and they're able to
Right.
create something that is amazing to watch. And if everyone in the bleachers was all of a sudden a New York Yankee, then it wouldn't be that exciting to watch the game, and then people wouldn't, you know what I mean? And so there's a
Yeah.
sense of like, is there a way to re-tribalize as a form of beauty and art and cultural expression and love for a particular way of relating while feeling the unified wholeness of that as a part of the fractal of the mandala,
Yeah.
that is all of humanity, or all of planetary life or the cosmos or the universe or God. And yeah, how I guess what I'm curious about is in some of your work and in your own life experience, um, how do you find how do you find ways to kind of play in that polarity of like opening up to all and being connected and really focusing on the here and now and the people that are in your direct vicinity, and then also reaching
Yeah.
out to me, for example, and having a conversation about a very specific topic that a lot of folks might not be that interested in, and kind of getting nerdy together, and we get to create our own uniqueness together.
Wow. Seems like there's a lot of questions in there.
Probably.
No, which is really good. I think I was going to say self-development, but I meant the no self-development or the I call it the shared self-development. So if you're starting with the idea that there's a separate self from which to achieve enlightenment or awakening, it's a kind of it creates an internal kind of mental prison. It may be more advanced than the previous version, but it's kind of more of a prettier prison. And what I've encountered in Sarvodaya that I've mentioned is an idea that I've labeled the shared self. So instead of being a separate self that's interacting with other cells, it's a shared self with one
Mm,
eye towards the transcendent and one towards my neighbor, towards the
mm,
other. Okay, so if you have that as your kind of construct, if you will, what develops out of that is love as an operating system to flow from each of us into our surroundings naturally and organically in a very specific, very trust-based and a sequential way that's not random. It's not like an idea I read, I went to school, or I went to church, or I learned in this group or that group. This was from, blood, sweat, and tears, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. Well, turns out what works is pretty simple, but it's very challenging again. And I'll give you some examples. So I was a businessman. I had a hyperbaric oxygen therapy business in the year 2000 in Reno, Nevada. So doing that business, I encountered a ton of doctors and
okay, you're back.
yeah, I was giving an example of how the connection of the transcendent manifests organically and extending out to our not natural world, but our human world and the natural world. So I was a businessman and I was doing a hyperbaric oxygen therapy business in the year 2000. So after a couple of years of that, I'd visit doctors and hospitals, and I would, as part of my business. So I was also at the time sensitive to, it was the build up to the Persian Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq in
Mm.
2003. So that was developing as well. So there was an environment where there was like a breakdown in America between the pro-war and the anti-war. So these things are polarization on these issues, obviously, just the way things are. It's a lot worse today. But then that was the spot. So someone suggested, hey, let's do this 10-week course on nonviolence that comes from the Catholic and the Quaker tradition. So we went through that. And what I realized, even as a businessman, I'm with people in a different context. We just really enjoyed each other's company. That I asked the question at the end of the course, is there anything we can do to connect the community and expand this feeling of aliveness and community that we have in this polarized environment? So the answer was yes, we could focus on what we have in common, like let's support locally owned businesses, family business, mom and pop, local main street businesses. Not whether they were regen or environmental or green or whatever, but just main street businesses was the context. So we had a series of meetings, and the first one, people got up and we had bulletin butcher paper, and people wrote down in categories all of the direct connections they had to all the businesses that they were doing business with and all the organizations. So it was like a unchoreographed dance in a big hall with people writing names of the business and names of the business owners. So that's how we got entree to an entire network through this collective intelligence
Mm.
practice.
Mm.
So the practice was, let's reveal what our existing organic connections are. Let's reveal what they are. And that led to the foundation of the first local living economy movement in Reno. And it happened naturally. So it happened, this is the initial group. And then there was like a planning group that developed a small circle of people, including me. So maybe 4 or 5 core group people that resonated and aligned, that reflected this fractal of divine love in action.
Mm.
We had to build an understanding of where our coherence was. And it was both, we talked about it, but we could feel it. So it's heart-based, but there's a mind-based aspect to it, because you got to say, well, okay, great. We have all this heart connection. What's the most optimal thing to do?
Mm.
Well, if you want to reach out to a region, then you would build networks that can extend to a whole region rather than an isolated smaller community like co-housing or intentional community. So we looked at this kind of network formation as like an intentional community without walls.
Mhm.
So what happened was, um, as these owners, business owners and leaders of nonprofits, local government came together in the building of this network was the experience of how to live with one another who have these differences. The experience, because they weren't all Democrats or progressive, they weren't all Republican business owners, but we had to, if our focus was, pro-local instead of anti-war or pro-war, we were pro-local, and we build this larger container. And that's based on the experience I had in San Diego working in that low income neighborhood around safety. It was the natural progression, the next step to see how these organic symbiotic networks emerge from these practical concerns that people have. At the time, it was basically the large national chains like Starbucks and Krispy Kreme donuts and all the other chains were starting to land in the community. So part of the crisis wasn't just the war in Iraq. The crisis was the invasion of the big box stores to Reno, Nevada at a slice of time. And that's why there was a opening. That was the context that made it so that people were more likely to come to a meeting to talk about bettering the community and why they were interested. It was not just all about some big idea that was intellectual or some worldview. It was
Mm.
very basic, like, wow, our society is really divided. and these big box stores are invading our community. What are we going to do? Are we going to
Mhm.
protest? No, we're not going to protest the war, pro or against, and we're not going to protest against Walmart. What's the point? Instead, we said, let's start building the basis for a parallel society and economy, starting with us. And let's have these organic connections be the way that it's founded. And it never has to become a formal structure like a nonprofit or for profit. It's irrelevant. It's a network centric structure. It's the simplest idea, again, but it's the hardest thing to do. And the hardest thing to do is to know how to hold space without promoting your own individual ideology or belief, like pushing your own business or pushing your religion or pushing your own philosophy, your own spiritual idea.
How do you hold space in that way, in the way that you're advocating?
So all I can do is share my own experience of holding space and what it felt like. So whether it's at building the local economy network, the next network we built was called the local food system network. It's the same principle, holding space. So for me personally, holding space in a room with what I perceive to be, wonderful people who were leading organizations and companies who had a variety of perspectives. So holding space for me then meant for me, it was praying and reestablishing a connection to divine love, to the transcendent. So that's the first thing, to be clear about that opening and that intention and the desire for unity. So when I have that intention, it means I'm calling to God, the universe, however you want to look at it. Experiences are going to show me and teach me whether I'm actually aligned with that or not.
Mhm.
So then holding space in the real world is like you're in a meeting and somebody makes an announcement. Like I remember 100 business and organization leaders together in, I don't remember when it was. Yeah, 2004, I think. Well, it was basically, again, somebody was wanting to protest. There was like a presidential election campaign. Somebody in the group said, "Let's go protest down in front of the convention center where the president, who was a Republican, was at." So that was something that happened in this frame of this format of a group. I had to decide as a facilitator, what the hell am I going to do? So I reflected on it and I was just really careful with my words, careful with my energy, careful in terms of not careful as in worried, but more judicious, respectful, honoring, thoughtful words. So I said, after this person made this announcement, let's go to the left wing protest gathering against the right wing president. I said, look, I am really happy to see your passion about what you believe in and what you feel is important. But your political perspective is not relevant here because, and I shared this with a group. I said, look, in this case, we need to focus on the local living economy and not whether you're supporting the president or not, or you're pro-war, anti-war or not. And if we allow people to present announcements that assume an identity, so this person just spoke into the space, just who knows? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe he assumed the people there were more left wing and they'd be open. But that makes the meeting not safe for people who supported the war or supported the president. They have every valid reason to. Can't just dismiss them as, oh yeah, they're supporting fascists or they're doing this. No, they have a right to have an opinion. It's valid. So how do you hold space when you have that conflict happening in the US at the time between around the war and a real life environment to maintain the integrity of the container? So
Mhm.
you have to realize as somebody holding space that you're in the eye of a hurricane. You have to be conscious of it. You have to be aware of the cultural landmines.
Mhm.
And the only way to do that is to actually become conscious of your own limitations.
Mhm.
What political or religious capture am I under right now that I don't even know. At the time, I had a progressive worldview. I had no clue about that. I was kind of anti-religion, but now I realize through time, I go, wow, I'm actually following Jesus and I identify as a Christian. So none of these categories are in themselves separating, but if you're creating this unifying container, you
Mm,
you have to really watch your own kind of triggering based
mhm.
on like unknown political capture. For me, it was progressive a viewpoint. I had to overcome it. Doesn't mean I stopped. I repudiated my beliefs or I became a conservative Republican. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking
Yeah.
about to build a unified community. By definition, it has to go beyond our capturing.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is that there is a practicality to focusing on a shared mission that everyone could relate to and identify with. And so there's a curation process of sort of a sensing of the boundaries of what's allowed in and out of the context that you're holding space for and
Yeah.
navigating that skillfully with respect and love and also bringing the collective attention back to the mission at hand that brought people together in the first place.
Yeah, that's well said. I would call it a functional context.
Hmm.
So you could almost create like this parallel. It's living these universal value virtues that come from divine love. So living those virtues in action in satisfying basic community needs.
Yes.
So those needs we identified as 12, including local economy, local water, food, housing, energy, arts and culture, clean and healthy environment. So we have these different functional areas that we'd identified through experience that they form organizations around issues like homelessness or regen or, forming a business about a particular idea, but it fell within these 12 functional categories. So having a functional purpose like that is a way, you're right, it really minimizes the amount of, let's call it either ideology creep or when you do any community event, there's always people that are coming in with their own narrow agendas and they're going to try to subvert it. It's just in
Hmm.
our nature. And I'm not being negative. I'm just saying the way it is. That's the way it is that people
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
So you have to create a container that can resist that.
Hmm.
And the only container that can resist that would be one in which you're saying, hey, we're focusing on building a local food system network, not on a progressive idea, not on your Christianity, not on your metamodern spirituality, not on your regen thing.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
something bigger, deeper. So I'm going to make a statement that I've never said this before because I don't even know how to say this, Tucker. Maybe you can help me.
Okay.
Seriously.
Yeah.
For 2 years, I've been engaging hundreds of leaders in all fields from all the tribes that I've identified 10 tribes that are building movements already in community. Many have existed for a long time. So my challenge is in speaking about symbiotic culture and the strategy, the approach, my sense now is that many leaders have assumed that I was building like a separate project called symbiotic culture, that
Mm-hmm.
it itself unconsciously would be competing with them.
Hmm.
I never realized that until I fully internalized this. So I've started to reframe how I interact with others, that I'm not looking for like some type of collaboration as if I'm representing an organization.
Yeah.
I'm sharing principles and a context that I have found works the best for uniting a community. And it starts with building trust around a large framing rather than any specific framing.
Yeah.
And the reason I believe this, and I think it's true, which is that the belief system that a Christian church could just keep being Christian, that somehow eventually what? All people are going to be Christian. Okay, I could see how they feel that. Regen, they're making the same fundamental assumption that we attract people, we raise money, we're bringing them into this worldview. Same with some metaphysical variety of spirituality, whether integral or metamodern or some other view. It's the same kind of principle. We
Hmm.
can't escape that. We just cannot escape that. That there's a belief associated with these different network silos, and it is, I believe, a hope that through time, through some self-organized emergent process, a coherent strategy will develop, and then we'll all be singing Kumbaya.
Hmm.
I just don't believe that. It's both and again. We
Hmm.
need self-organizing emergent groups and sub-tribes, but we also need to bridge across the tribes. And
Hmm.
you can't do that with an additional worldview that's in conflict with other worldviews. So when I talk about a relational worldview, what I mean is, in addition to all the tribes doing their wonderful work, in order to build a parallel culture movement of all of them that have differences, it can only happen when you're not trying to push something on people, but rather like, yeah, we are acknowledging we have all these differences. Let's celebrate them, but let's create a bigger pattern that's more in alignment with divine love than the current existing system of
Hmm.
empire.
Beautiful. Yes, I feel like I could, talk for probably 4 more hours just on all this because there's so much here. And yeah, I want to share that I'm creating with my creative partner, Cheryl Shu, it's called the Source Keepers Guild. And part of that is around bringing a group of a specific tribe together, you could say, but then bringing in what John Churchill calls a sacred secular operating system that unites kind of this core functionality and way of relating that can be a blueprint that is applied to other communities that creates like a mesh network that
Yeah.
allows for the individuality and the uniqueness of a particular group of people that resonate with a certain note and a larger harmony, but to feel themselves as part of not only a cultural movement, but also a spiritual movement, a movement that is connecting them to the boundless, timeless wholeness of all that is.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm curious about is for you, you've mentioned a lot about projects you've worked on in the past and about some of the stuff that you're up to now with writing the book over the past 4 years. Looking forward, and maybe we'll end here. Looking forward, do you have a sort of a vision or a hope or a prayer that guides you around how, if this work was to unfold and these ideas were to be implemented more broadly, where do you see that going in 20, 50, 100 years from now?
Um, Great. I think there were questions. There was a comment and then a question. So the comment was about, your own work. Then it's called the Source Keeper. Is that right?
The Source
Yeah,
Keepers
I
Guild, yeah.
started
Mhm.
reading more about it, and I'm in real alignment with what you're trying to do. And this gets full circle to my comment. And I've been trying to think about when I was making a comment, which is you need both coherence, that is a container for like-minded people to come together. That's true. But most containers that emerge, maybe even including SourceKeeper, are emerging in a culture of separation. So in
Mhm.
other words, it's possible that within a certain context, it's obviously doing valuable work. The question is, how permeable is it to the mainstream, and does it have any chance of actually going beyond itself and
Mhm.
connecting others? And what I'm positing is, from the existing structure, I don't believe it can, because every single network silo is doing that from their own perspective. They're all
Mhm.
in a if it's aware or they're unaware, but we're in a battlefield, and it's part of our economic and system and our cultural system. So we're operating in this battlefield. The question you had isn't so much. I mean, what you're doing is wonderful. The question is, I've been asking a different question. I think it sounds like you're asking about how is it possible to create an island of coherence and have that as the foundational element for a new civilization. And what I'm saying is that's wonderful. It's beautiful, but in isolation, it won't be permeable to all the other silos that are trying to do something similar.
Mhm.
So it's a both and.
I think I'm saying something in a third thing, which is what is the what I call the mesh network infrastructure
Yeah,
that can bridge those two
understood.
so that there's a larger wholeness that is that is bringing the kind of the unifying work that you're doing with the hyper distinct coherence work that I've been doing and can cross-pollinate the two into a larger third thing that we could call culture, maybe.
Well, you ask wonderful, amazing questions. This is really
Thank
good.
you.
They're very deep. Thank you,
Yeah.
Tucker, for that. So, mesh networks, as you're talking about, that I'm familiar with, they organize around a lot of different coherent ideas and principles. And that's happening. I get it. That's already happening. It's natural for that to happen. The question is there a distinction between a network that emerges from a metaphysical alliance where people have to have a metaphysical worldview
Hmm.
prior to there being coherence?
Hmm.
I'm 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 in a parallel universe,
Hmm.
really, to be honest. In the universe that I'm in, that's one approach, building metaphysical alliance with those that want to build coherence around that particular, let's call it a mental thought construction. Even if it's beautiful and it
Sure.
contains words like love and divine love, it's still a construction. So that process within the current culture still leads to isolation.
Hmm.
And there still needs to be some broader mesh network that doesn't dominate or control like an empire, but there's a broader mesh network that connects all the mesh networks.
Right.
It'd be like somebody would say to me, "Well, Richard, your starting point for building this process and community is what I call a symbiotic circle." And somebody would rightly say, "There are thousands or millions of circles. So how is that different?" Well, I'm not trying to make distinctiveness, but this is my challenge in communicating this idea. What's different about a symbiotic circle would be that it's actually connecting all circles.
Hmm.
It's not trying to take its metaphysical or intellectual stream and promote that to try to get people to join it. It's
Hmm.
doing the opposite function. It's helping the existing networked silos that are isolated to connect and build bridges across them to all of the network silos. In order to do that, you're not having a metaphysical belief system
Hmm.
of that's separating. It's not that it's not a worldview, but it is, but it's a relational worldview based on, in a sense, an identification and unity around the transcendent principle that that we hold. So
Yeah.
that's broad. That could include religious, theists, but non-religious, spiritual folks, atheists,
Yes.
agnostic, civic engagement people. So what I was doing was trying to come up with a worldview that wasn't going to impose it on others, like a one ring to rule them all, like the Lord of the
Hmm.
Rings. So it's not like that because that's just ego and dominance. This is a specific relational worldview whose purpose is to bring together that which has been separate, to unify the cosmos in love.
Hmm.
That's what this is about. So it's not a project in a traditional sense of being separate from other projects. It's not an
Yeah.
organization that's separate from other organizations. It's like the catalytic fuel for what I call fractal community empowerment. It allows love itself to actually then go into the bridges between all the networks so they can all be raised up together.
Yes. I had the feeling that you sense that I don't understand, and I want to posit the possibility that I do understand what you're saying, and that yeah, in a way, I experience reality itself as that, like just awareness itself,
Yeah, yeah,
wholeness
yeah.
itself is the mesh network that brings all these different fractals together, and to create an invitation into the awareness of that, and then to create structures and forms that can kind of point to that, but then also scaffold that in productive ways is, I think, important. Yeah, one thing I just want to share is that where I'm coming from with something like metamodernism is there's many people in the metamodern movement, including some of my very dear friends, who I do notice have a bit more of an advocative quality to it of like, let's get people to like, let's go find others and kind of convert them into this worldview and bring them in. That probably lives in me, as certainly has in the past. And where I'm orienting more to it now is just like a great jazz band or a rock band or something.
Oh, yeah,
They don't
yeah,
want they don't want they're just playing jazz music. They just love jazz music. They don't want everyone to be a jazz musician. That's
yeah,
insane. Like,
yeah.
why would everyone want to be a jazz musician? They're just playing the trumpet because they love the trumpet. And I love the song of metamodernism. I love kind of the uniqueness and the particular textures and qualities of what it's inviting
Yeah.
in. But I can say this with a lot of I feel that I'm 99% in truth when I say this is like I don't give a flying fuck if anyone else becomes metamodern or identifies as that. Like
Oh,
if I really, it's much more about like just loving a particular expression. And if others resonate with that, then like, oh, let's come dance together for a bit. But let's see through the emptiness of it as a construction of the mind and return back to the larger wholeness in which that arises as a celebration of life, you could say.
I really appreciate what you just said. And to be honest, I heard what you just said that you felt that um, you thought I was saying that you don't understand. And if that's how you felt I was coming across, I really apologize. I was
No, it's
actually
all good. It's all good.
I wasn't meaning that specifically. I was just talking about the frustration I've had
Yeah, yeah,
in communicating over years, my book. And
yeah,
I'm using this frustration to obviously develop empathy and love, right? Rather than staying frustrated. But it's
yeah,
been fuel to show me how to communicate better
yeah.
and where the blind spots are that I'm not seeing in the way that I'm messaging it, to understand where are all the cultural landmines. That's why I've moved, but amongst all the tribes, I'm trying to understand their perspective and their worldview. One thing I'm going to say though, and we don't obviously this could be a separate conversation, or maybe it's another conversation, maybe it's
Sure.
private, but it'd be about this. What I've noticed, and this really, I'm going to give you a specific example, and I don't think it's far afield, but what I've seen in a variety of the metamodern constructs, and I'm part of different groups that I
Hmm.
get that content. Is I had this call once, it was a Zoom call. There was a lady who was a peace activist who's, globally working. She wanted to work in her community. We were talking wonderfully high level until I said the following. I said, yeah, because she asked me, where did I understand about sacred design? I said, from Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, but then in my relationship with Jesus. And then I started encountering and realized that I'm aligned as being a Christian. I kid you not. She shifted and she immediately said something like the following. And I'm okay this being public. It's not personal. I'm not naming anybody, but she said that she was part of the integral movement for like decades. And that non-duality became kind of like this holy grail.
Hmm.
And she was basically reflecting and she was saying, no, Christian churches and Christians, they don't have any business being involved in community. And she essentially said they need to repent for the imperialism and the conquest that has happened as part of empire. That's
Yeah.
certainly a lot of truth to it. I'm bringing this up because I think one of the main divisions that I'm seeing in making this mesh network of all mesh networks happen is
Yeah.
this separation between these two main worldviews, the religious and the non-religious.
Yeah.
So I don't think metamodernism yet has integrated traditional ideas that are found within traditional. You know why I know this? Because I'm seeing people trying to form a post-Christian metamodern Christianity.
Hmm.
They think that project is going to solve the problem, but it just shows that is part of the problem. That is, they haven't figured out a way to integrate with traditional Christians and reaching out. And I've spent decades doing that.
Hmm.
I'm not
Yeah.
separate from them, I mean, and I'm not separate from you. I'm not separate from
Yeah.
anybody,
Yeah.
but you got to somehow walk in people's shoes before
Totally.
trying to exclude them. And so I would say that woman in that conversation was expressing a metaphysical elitism that stated that non-duality is the prize and any personal relationship to God is somehow either primitive along the
Yeah.
developmental lines of integral theory. And I'm going to say it, I think that itself is a dualistic view. The belief that non-duality is the peak and pinnacle,
Yeah.
and that it's better than traditional forms of religion like Christianity is itself a form of elitism that's separating itself from
Yeah.
what could be a universal expression that could actually contain theists and non-theists. So I'm going to just leave the how that's possible. I identified these two totally seemingly disparate, uh, really like saints. So there's Saint Maximus the Confessor, an Orthodox Christian monk in the 7th century, and there's Sri Aurobindo, who basically came up in the 19th century in parallel with Mahatma Gandhi in the independence movement. He started as a kind of a violent revolutionary. Aurobindo went to more of a spiritual worldview. But his idea of an integral yoga and the idea of St. Maximus about bringing all that which is separate in the cosmos together to unify the cosmos in love, they sound very similar. And I'm saying I discovered that within these two disparate traditions. And St. Maximus is a Christian, for gosh sakes, and he's within an Orthodox Christian tradition. And it's
Mhm.
got to be okay.
Mhm.
This is what you're going to face in these movements is that they self-identify like in
Mhm.
their metaphysical allegiance, but they don't even know what their metaphysical allegiance is. And the reason I'm saying this is important is because I didn't know what I used to say stuff like, well, I don't really have a belief. But in order to finish my book, I had to figure out what it is I did believe in. And I
Yeah.
realized that there's this, it's kind of a both and that you can have a personal relationship to God through Jesus Christ and have a non-dual experience of reality at the same time.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I would just I would invite you
I don't,
remain open to the possibility that the metamodern movement as a whole is going through its own
I
developmental
got you.
process, and that many people are coming into this recognition and are really living a deeper integration, and that it's
Yeah,
happening.
I didn't want to, gosh, I didn't want to leave on that note, but it was very tangible though in what we're
Yeah.
facing and in your question and how you talk about coherence, but permeability. I think there's very few ways to have both internal coherence with one tribal subgroup and the
Hmm.
mainstream.
Hmm.
Invariably it just becomes a parallel stream and it can't really actually transform the mainstream. And what I'm sharing is a both and way and method of doing that people come together within their own inside tribal coherence,
Yeah.
however it is, but knowing that they have to help support the building of bridges across to all the other silos.
Yeah.
Else, who's going to build the bridges? With the people, the leaders of all these movements promoting their own brand and branding and marketing themselves, I think they're not available yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, from a village perspective, and I don't mean an actual concrete village, a land-based village, but if we look at humanity as a village,
Yeah,
my sense is that diversity of archetypes is important. So just like
yeah,
you want a master carpenter that just focuses on building wood, they're not thinking about how to, sustainably log and then and then to like have good meals that are eaten on top of on top of the tables. There's a specificity that brings
yeah.
out a craftsmanship that is something beautiful that we admire. And then there's folks who are generalists who are more looking at the connection between things. And then there are those who are even holding more of the universal as and more of the transcendent aspects as well. And so
Yeah,
if
that's
different
perfect. Yeah.
archetypes can cohere together as part of the larger whole and they can have some awareness of each other, but also allowing people to be called to the uniqueness of their mission work, you could say, of that which they're
Yeah.
truly
I,
here to
I,
give as a medicine.
man, thank you for saying that. And I'm in total agreement and it's in alignment with what I'm saying. I'm just saying is that while having diversity and having this kind of more inclusion,
Hmm.
a sensibility or an idea of it, that's one thing. It's the reality on the ground is another. And what
Totally.
I am claiming is regenerative movements and networks that I am familiar with, and metamodern spiritual
Mhm.
movements and networks that I'm familiar with are developing their own ideological, metaphysical foundation that's separate
Hmm.
from theists, from the
Hmm.
religious. And it's not just that it's separate, is that the way they're identifying with it is as if it's progressively better than what's come before. That's
Hmm.
an unconscious sensibility that will keep what you're talking about, having the different tribes from coming together. If each of the tribes think that they're the thing and that they're
Hmm.
the vanguard, what I learned is even though I was stepping out front, I'm not the vanguard when I hold space to build a unified village.
Yeah.
Not a vanguard in the sense that it's my idea. I'm a vanguard in the sense that I'm capable of wanting to hold space for all the disparate tribes to come together for some type of meta network formation. That
Yeah.
type of process doesn't create an empire or a coalition that's dominant. It
Yeah.
just creates interstitial tissue. So my focus and my challenge, especially with my book, and I appreciate you holding space for me to share what's in my heart because
Yeah.
I'm, I struggle, I'm like you, like everybody else, and I'm doing my best with my book to communicate an idea that it's a both and idea, so it's challenging.
Totally.
I want to go beyond every polarity without the polarities having to be, absorbed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what you were talking about, I think. And the last
Yeah,
thing,
absolutely.
yeah, like the regenerative movement is a great example. They don't reach out to local businesses, like regular Main Street businesses or organizations, unless unless those businesses or organizations in Main Street America or in Europe already pre-agree with their construct. They have to agree either they're going to build donut economies or solidarity economies, or they're going to relocalize with a progressive focus, or they're going to do regenerative culture, which has more of an indigenous metaphysical base. All of those things keeps us keeps us separate if we don't know that it's happening. And
Hmm.
I'm not, of course, I'm compassionate about it, but I'm doing my best to communicate something that's important, which is not that these separate tribes need to stop what they're doing. It's just
Hmm.
that we're at a point where we need this larger infrastructure building, and I'm asking them to participate in building those bridges with me. And I'm
Yeah.
here to show these networks how to grow their own network and at the same time build a meta network bigger than itself. I can share. That's what my book is about. How to do that.
Beautiful. All right. Well, so is that the besides for folks reading your book, is there any specific way that people can dive deeper into what you're advocating for?
I appreciate that request. Is it okay? I just mentioned my
Yeah. Yeah,
contact.
please.
Yeah, so I'm at really simple domain, richardflyer.com. So richardflyer, one word.com. It's actually a Substack site, and there's a lot of videos in there. Hopefully, this video will be included as part of video interviews. And there's a bunch of essays, and there's some FAQs in there to kind of orient. There's also a strategy piece, and that's what it's called when you go to the website, you'll see strategy. Well, you can click it and it'll express this hopefully simpler and more coherent than I did today.
No, you're great, Richard. I really appreciated the conversation, and it is true that you have you have some very specific structures and principles and values that you've listed, and there's a lot of really great information. So I really encourage people to check out your book and Substack as well. And thank you. I'm so grateful for everything that you're up to in the world. I feel a lot of resonance. I'm grateful that you exist and that what's coming through you is finding its way into form from the transcendent and beyond to the here and now, all as one whole. It's a great gift.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity and holding space for the idea and for me personally. And I look forward to finding out ways more practically about, supporting you in development of those networks, those mesh networks that you're
Yeah,
looking at. I'm happy to just be a sounding board and listen.
thank you.
And
Perfect.
you know, I'm not doing it as a consultant or that's not business for me. That's
Yeah.
literally this is what I'm here to do.
Yeah.
So I
Thank
help
you
you.
so much.
All right,
Grateful
man.
for that. Take care, Richard.
Bye bye.
Bye.